Hello everybody, I'd like to say welcome, or perhaps welcome back to the channel. If you really enjoy what I'm doing in these videos or with my narrations, please feel free to hit the subscribe button, and if you want to stay updated, ring the bell icon to stay notified. If you don't want to subscribe but still enjoy these videos, please hit the like button and leave a comment, as every little bit helps. And for those of you listening who have your own stories that you'd like to have narrated, whether they be true or fictional, about encounters in the shadows or in the dark, with the supernatural or just the sinister, you can send those in to ashes2ashes, dust2dust stories at gmail.com. Should I read your story, I'll give you a shout out on the video to either your name or your handle, whichever you prefer. You'll find the correct spelling of that, by the way, down in the description. And now, without further ado, let's get into tonight's scary stories. An interaction with a pedophile. My name is Morgan, and at the time of this story, I was 14. I'm a girl who enjoys the nerdier side of life. This was my first experience playing Dungeons and Dragons with a few of my friends at a place called the Sci-Fi Factory. This is a public place, and to be honest, the place is worse for wear. There's holes in the plastic tables, gunk on the floor, shitty outlets, and even shittier people. The people here range from decent to flat out creepy. This is something I learned the hard way. As I was setting up my elf rogue character, a man came over to my group. Let's call him Robbie. He told us he was 24 and talked to my friends. They seemed to know each other, so I was more than okay with letting him join us. He was white, brown hair, busted glasses that made his eyes look bigger than they really were, and nothing out of the ordinary clothing. He introduced himself and his age, and then asked the same of me. I told him I was Morgan, and I was 14. Robbie quickly showed his weirder side. Even if it wasn't the conversation piece, he'd complain about how much of a dumb bitch his girlfriend was, and tell her he came here just to avoid her. He didn't break up with the bitch because she was his only source of income and shelter. He hated her. That was clear. He also bragged about the knife he stole from Walmart, and he even showed it to us. Hell, he let me hold it and taught me how to flip it in and out without hurting myself. Remember those glasses? Well, they were busted and broken up from a bar fight. That really unnerved me about this guy. He seemed so kind and friendly, but he was casually talking about assaulting people. Then, he did what I never expected him to do. He got my attention and made me lean towards him so I can see his Android phone still plugged into the wall to charge. He had a notes app open, and it read, "Hey, I know this sounds creepy, but oh god, this can't end well. I think we should totally date." There was a whole paragraph more written, but I didn't need to see what he thought of me. He expected some sort of response, so I gave him one. "Oh no, I'm not really interested in a relationship." "Oh, that's cool. That's cool. Still friends?" "Yeah." What was I supposed to say? No to the guy that's been in a bar fight and has a knife on him? Neither of my two friends heard our conversation, so I was stuck next to Robbie for the next hour until our session was over. During that time, I offered Robbie some gummy worms. They weren't my favorite thing in the world, but the Dollar Tree nearby has good prices. He laughed and said to me, "Food is the way to a man's heart. Are you trying to seduce me right now?" No? You can say it's a joke and doesn't have any deeper meaning than that, but coming from the man 10 years older than me, who had just asked me out, I wasn't really laughing at it. When I left the store after the session had ended, I told my friends what had happened. They believed me and told me he was kind of a weird guy. I have been back to that store and ran into him once again. He was with a group of friends and a girl I recognized. He kept on asking me to come over, and I insisted no. My friends, who I was with already, knew the story, and I was admittedly nervous. Even as we were leaving, he tried to get me to come over, but after that, I never saw him again. I later learned that it's because he was arrested for assault and vandalizing school property. Funny thing is, he doesn't go to any school. My stalker story. This happened last year, when I was 15. Me and my friend, I'll call her Kate, were messing around in our neighborhood one day. We were on the side of the road, playing around with sparklers and other stuff like that. Suddenly, Kate said to turn around and look behind me. I did, and when I looked at the home behind us, I saw someone looking through the window. I couldn't really tell what he looked like, so I just ignored it and turned around. A few minutes later, Kate said to look again. I did, but this time there was a woman with him at the window. They were just staring at us, and I began to feel uneasy. But again, I turned around and ignored them. As the sun went down, I walked back to my house, which was across the street, and Kate went to hers, which was a few blocks away. A couple hours later, at around 10, my phone lit up. I was watching Orange is the New Black, so at first I ignored it. Then I got another alert, so I picked up my phone and looked at the screen. My two alerts were from Snapchat. Someone added me, and the username was something like Jaden, with a few numbers after it, and then they sent me a picture. I waited until the episode was over to open it. It was a black screen with a message saying, "Hey." I ignored that message. Around 6 to 7 minutes later, I got another Snapchat from the same guy, and this time it was a black screen saying, "Why didn't you answer?" Again, I ignored the snap and went back to Netflix. When my phone buzzed again, I didn't look at it. Throughout the episode, I got around 4 more alerts, which I ignored all of them. Then I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I had 11 alerts. Most of them were black screens saying, "Why aren't you answering?" or "I know you're awake, answer me." But the last one freaked me out. It was a picture of my house, taken from across the street, with a caption, "Answer me now." I was stupid, so I didn't screenshot the pictures, but I did block him. I didn't hear anything for a few days, but then I got another alert that someone added me. It was the same username as before, but with a 1 after it. Then I got sent multiple snaps. I didn't open any of them because I was in class. 4 hours later, I checked my Snapchat. All the pictures he sent me were pictures of me. Some were during lunch, and some were when I was walking home from school. Again, I blocked the user, and I didn't get any screenshots. Last night, I got a snap of my window, again taken from across the street, and from the same user, but this time with a 2 after it. I told my dad, and he freaked out and called the police. When they arrived, I told them everything, but they couldn't do anything since I didn't get any screenshots. I don't know what to do. Update. I deleted Snapchat, but he has found me on other social medias. I've blocked him on everything, and I'm thinking about deleting everything. The man in the truck. Okay, so this happened just a few days ago when I was on a road trip with my cousin. I'll be referring to him again as James, like I have in past stories. For a quick reference, I'm 13 and female. James is 21. James and I were on a road trip from my grandmother's to my aunt's house. I have a great relationship with my cousin, so my parents let me go on trips with him occasionally. It's about a 10-hour drive, and we were about 3 hours into it. It was about 9 p.m. at the time. I was pretty sleep deprived, and everything was hilarious at that moment. So when I saw this red semi-truck outside my window, I just laughed my ass off. The man in the truck was heavyset, that's an understatement, and had a long, untamed beard. He had a creepy vibe, but I waved at him. He, in turn, did a groping motion to me. Finding it more hilarious than creepy, I started laughing harder and told James the story, doing the whole groping motion and all. He looked creeped out and disgusted, but there wasn't anything either of us could do. A while later, around 4.5 hours into our drive, James pulled into a rest stop. I walked into the bathroom, and when I came out, the man was just standing there. He looked to be 6 feet tall at least. I looked out the glass door leading into the building and saw James glaring daggers at the door. I was confused and walked back to the car. What he told me really creeped me out. So much so, I started crying. Then again, I had been awake for 20 hours. The man had stared and followed me inside the building, mumbling shit about me. James said he was basically talking normally. He attempted to comfort me, but quickly said he had to go to the bathroom and went inside. A few seconds later, when I was in the car, the guy was at my window. He stared at me, a wide, creepy grin. He started saying I should go with him, and he was gonna treat me good. He offered me candy and just tried to coax me into his truck. I was busy bawling my eyes out. Then, right on cue, James walks out and yells at the guy and threatening him. The guy backed off and got into his truck. He still just stared at me, the grin still on his face. We floored it out of there. We wanted to get far from that guy. It was around midnight when we pulled to a motel to sleep. The rest of the night, until 8 a.m., was fine. Nothing really happened. Sadly, that didn't last long. When we were at a restaurant eating breakfast, the same fat shit sat across from us. He grinned at me, and James just looked pissed off. The guy walked by the table when going to the bathroom and brushed his hand on my shoulder, doing the same on the way back. A quick note, James is a chill dude and will let most things slide, but because he's known me since I was just a baby, he's very protective over me. He's not like that to even my siblings. He and I are close. He was obviously pissed before, but at that point, he stood up from his seat and walked over to the guy's table. He started yelling shit about how he better stop following us and back off of me. He made no threats, but did curse a lot. I felt pretty nervous and just wanted to go. The guy stood up and smacked James and yelled how I was leading him on. The guy was about 6 feet and James was 6'8". Their argument continued until the cops came and separated it. They got the story and came to the conclusion that because he was assaulted, we could press charges. He said no, and we just continued the day. The rest of the trip was pretty bland. The guy wasn't seen for the rest of it. However, James did follow me like a bodyguard whenever we went anywhere. Even though he was protecting me, I was terrified. He looks scary as shit, but he's a cinnamon roll. My bad neighbor. For most of my childhood, my family and I lived one house away from a pedophile. For the sake of this story, I'll call him Mr. Stan. Our old neighborhood started at the top of a hill and went down to a small lake where the road turned right and branched off into a cul-de-sac and another residential road. Mr. Stan's house was at the top of the hill, and ours was in the middle. Mr. Stan lived in the neighborhood long before we moved in. It's hard for me to remember any vivid details about him, as I was very young at the time. But what I do remember is that every time he saw us, his face would scrunch up as if he smelled something terrible. There was one house between his place and ours, something I'm very grateful for. I don't know what life would have been like if we had to live right next to him. Right from when we were very little, my parents were very strict about walking past Mr. Stan's house. They told us that Mr. Stan was sick in the head, and if he ever asked us to come into his house, we were never, ever allowed to do so by ourselves. For years, no one told us exactly why Mr. Stan was bad, but we didn't need details. We just knew to avoid him. The look he gave us whenever he was working on his car or planting flowers in his garden was enough. When my sister and I would walk up the hill to school, we would cross the street when we got to his place, just to be safe. Like I said, I don't remember very much about Mr. Stan, and his twisted story begins long before I was even born. For this, I turned to my mum to fill in the details. Mum said that before we'd ever moved into the cul-de-sac, around the late 70s or early 80s, Mr. Stan already had the reputation of being a heavy drinker. He would get drunk and go over to the house of the family right across the street from us to do terrible things to the daughter while she was babysitting. The daughter tried to tell her mother about it, but since she was a rebellious child, her mother didn't believe her. Her family and Mr. Stan's family were actually good friends. Mr. Stan worked as a corrections officer, and soon accusations surfaced that Mr. Stan and another officer molested their co-worker's kid regularly. Mr. Stan was able to avoid conviction by ratting out the other officer, but in the process he lost his job. As far as I know, he never really worked after that. Mr. Stan had 2 daughters of his own, and while the older one claimed she was molested and suffered from mental problems as a result, the younger one said she was never mistreated in any way and grew up to be a very positive person. Mr. Stan's wife stood by her husband and claimed he was innocent throughout the whole ordeal. Ironically, the older daughter's emotional instability resulted in her children going to live with Grandpa. More on that in a moment. When my family moved into our house in the cul-de-sac, our next-door neighbor, a kind but nosy old man, told my dad to keep my sister and I away from Mr. Stan. He told my parents the gossip and Mr. Stan's history with children, which understandably horrified them both. As a result, my mum and dad were wary of him from the start. Mr. Stan was cordial enough. He would wave hello to my family and all that neighborly stuff. According to Mum, he even offered to babysit my little sister and I, to which my parents politely but emphatically declined. Then, sometime around 2002, my dad was going to work when he came across a neighborhood kid, let's call her Lana, on her way up the street. My dad is a chatty person, and so he asked Lana what she was up to. Lana told him she was going to Mr. Stan's house to give him a back rub. Dad knew that something was off, and so he told Lana's parents. To his surprise, they weren't alarmed at all, and said that sort of thing happened all the time. According to Mum, when Lana was older, Dad asked her if Mr. Stan ever acted inappropriately toward her during those visits, and her answer was definitely. When my sister was in kindergarten and I was in grade 3, Mr. Stan's grandkids came to live with him and his wife, for reasons I mentioned earlier. My parents couldn't believe this was allowed by anyone, especially considering the allegations and neighborhood gossip about Mr. Stan. His granddaughter was in the same kindergarten class as my sister, and his grandson was about my age. Mum told me that it was so disturbing to see the sweet little granddaughter at school every day and know what was probably going on behind closed doors. My parents have always had strong morals, particularly my dad. They would often talk about what they should do. They wanted to report Mr. Stan to the authorities before any harm could come to his grandchildren. Mum and Dad knew that if they reported Mr. Stan, they would be putting themselves at risk, and the rest of the neighborhood was no help. Mum said it was as if they were all hiding under rocks and turning a blind eye to what was happening. In the end, my parents' strong morality won out, and they decided, with the risk of being exposed as whistleblowers, to report Mr. Stan to the principal at my elementary school. The principal, in turn, called the ministry, who sent people to Mr. Stan's house for home visits and investigations. In the end, it was decided that the grandchildren would be removed from Mr. Stan's house. Mum isn't sure how it happened, but somehow it was leaked that my parents were the ones who reported Mr. Stan as a child molester. She thinks Lana's family may have had a hand in it, and, as Mum put, that's where the real fun began. Mr. Stan was no longer friendly toward my family. No more waves, no more chit-chat. Instead, he would target my mum with his car if she was walking down the road alone, or scream obscenities at my dad as he went to work. A few times he crossed the center line to scare us if we passed each other while driving. He told my dad that he ruined his life and that he was a horrible person. Thinking about that now really boils my blood, because my dad is one of the kindest and most considerate men I know. Mum was miserable and wanted to move, but Dad, as unshakable as he is, said he wasn't in a hurry. Mum told me it took 3 years of house hunting before she finally convinced Dad it was time to go. Only after all of this when we had been living in our beautiful new home out in the country, did I finally start to uncover the details to this story. But sadly, it doesn't end there. After we moved out of the cul-de-sac, Lana and other girls who were now grown up came forward to report Mr. Stan and what he had done. He was hauled into court for a second time, and this time there was no one he could rat on to save himself. The testimony against him was building up. My parents followed the trail in the newspaper. They wanted to see him put away for all of the terrible things he'd done. I have no memory of these proceedings, of course, and nobody wanted to explain it to me. I don't blame them. Mr. Stan was not only a former corrections officer, but now he was also a convicted pedophile. He knew he would not last long if he went to prison. So on a quiet morning, 1 week before his sentencing, Mr. Stan took a hunting rifle and shot himself. The folks who moved into Lana's house after her family left were walking their kids to school when they heard the shot. Mum tells me that the image of that scene haunts her to this day. I think she imagines what it would have been like if it were her walking my sister and I to school in place of that other family. Or maybe she was disturbed to learn that Mr. Stan had a gun. I know it sounds harsh, but I'm glad he's gone. He can never hurt another child again. My memories of this whole ordeal are far less interesting than the actual event. But one thing I do remember very clearly is being afraid of Mr. Stan's house. I knew it was dangerous. In my memory, it was painted black with white stucco. The car park and stairs to the front door were all underneath the wood roof, which cast the entire front of the house into shadow. To me, it was a monster house, though I didn't know why. My sister and I only ever went to Mr. Stan's front door once. It was Halloween, and my parents decided it was okay for us to trick-or-treat at his house, since they would be standing at the bottom of the stairs. I was actually very reluctant to go, and my parents had to encourage me that it was okay. Mr. Stan's house was the only one that didn't need Halloween decorations to be scary. So my sister and I cautiously climbed the stairs and rang the doorbell. Mr. Stan's wife opened the door. She was kind to us and gave us candy, and I remember being surprised that Mr. Stan's wife was so nice. But what I remember most was that I wanted to see inside the forbidden house. For some reason, this is still stuck with me. I looked behind Mrs. Stan, and there was Mr. Stan, in a wife-beater top, beer belly and all, sitting in an armchair watching TV. It was dim in the living room, except for a lamp and the glow of the TV. Mr. Stan didn't look at us. For years, I wondered if that was what bad men looked like. When I think about this story now, 11 years later, it really hits me how dark my neighborhood was under the surface. It's quite disturbing to me, because my childhood was actually quite happy. I was too young to notice anything wrong. I couldn't sense the tension that my parents lived with every day. I didn't know how much potential danger my sister and I were in. All I knew was that it was a beautiful day to play with my marbles and go to the lake. But now that I think of it, Mr. Stan may have been the reason that my parents bought a copy of You Can Say No, a picture book that teaches children about safety around bad people. I think my parents handled the situation very well, and I am so thankful they were attentive and brave during the whole thing. This story could have gone very differently. When I think about our old house on the cul-de-sac, it's usually happy memories I think of first. Mom tells me that despite all the trouble they went through, neither she or Dad regret the decisions they made. And she left me with one last ominous message. They say that every neighborhood has a pedophile living there. Most of the time, we just don't know.